Hello and welcome to Burke and Ryan. I'm Latika Burke.
And I'm Mick Ryan.
And this is our podcast where we'll explore topics around national security, modern conflict and more.
Hi everyone, it's Latika and I'm flying solo this week. Apologies to Mick's fans, but as mentioned in last week's episode, I recently caught up with Australia's Opposition Foreign Affairs spokesman Simon Birmingham. We were together in Prague at the recent GLOBSEC security conference, so we sat down and recorded this discussion. Apologies, it was recorded in a very busy hotel lobby as the conference was wrapping up. And apologies to Mick's fans, it's Burke and Ryan minus Mick Ryan this week, but don't worry, he'll be back next week. And we hope you enjoy this discussion.
Simon Birmingham, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be with you.
Tell me firstly, what motivated you to travel to Ukraine?
There's the symbolism, obviously, the wish to ensure that Australia's clear support for Ukraine is expressed, but also there's a practical desire of wanting to better understand how our support is delivering on the ground, what more we can do, and also to project the messaging back to Australia as to why it remains important for Australia and Australians to support Ukraine towards victory and a clear victory in this fight against Russia.
Had you been to Ukraine before?
I'd never been to Ukraine before, and I have to confess to falling a little bit in love with Kyiv, its city, its people, its architecture, which seems strange to say in the middle of a war, but ultimately the resilience and the attitude of the people is so inspiring, as well as a city and a country that clearly has so much to offer, and also a country that can be an increasing friend, ally and partner of Australia's in the years to come. We have so much that we would have common interests in terms of agricultural policy and trade policy and other things that are quite complementary in terms of our outlooks on the world.
Tell me about the actual practicalities of getting to Ukraine, because it's not an easy feat to get to Kyiv these days. What was your journey like?
A long 10 hours in a car with multiple stops at the service station to kind of maintain sustenance on the way there, and the same on the way back. All of it done during daylight for safety purposes, and the things that you, of course, realise Australians got used to during COVID, having to download their COVID apps on their phones. Well, in Ukraine, you download the air raid warning system app on your phone and say which regions you're going to be in, and then all too tragically, all too frequently, your phone sounds like an air raid warning and gives you the signal that there are reasons for concern and to take advice about whether you need to shelter or not.
Was that your first kind of feeling of entering a war zone, downloading that app?
For Ukraine, it was quite striking. I visited Israel in December last year, and on that visit, so soon after the October 7 attacks, when Hamas was still firing rockets, as was Hezbollah at different times, checking into a hotel where you're advised, here is the quickest pathway to the basement, this is what you do. And when you go to bed at night, sort of having that neat little pile of your passport and your phone and your wallet and everything there to be able to pick up and get out of the room as quickly as you can. Similar in both countries, and they're little things, but the thing to, of course, take away is this is day-to-day reality for the people living there. And in Ukraine, even there, the day-to-day reality differs. It's a huge country. And so for those on the front line, and I met a number of families that have been displaced, their experiences are, of course, truly horrific. For many, it is stress and sleep deprivation and concern for loved ones or people who have gone to fight on the front line. But for others, it is loss of those loved ones, loss of their home, loss of all that they had as part of their lives.
It sounds like you're talking about a kind of everyday wear and tear that adds to the experience of war that I think most people in Australia could never, ever, fortunately, have to contemplate.
No, and I had this amazing experience of talking to people who'd lost their homes and were receiving support from World Vision and their local partner Save Ukraine. And after chatting with a number of parents about the support for their kids and other things, I said, what would your message be to us and to me to take away? And her response wasn't, give us more money or do this for us. She said, appreciate peace. Appreciate what you have. And so for Australians, thankfully, we don't have to live and can't conceive really of living in that type of environment. But for those who've found that as a reality, I think they really know what it is they've lost and obviously what it is they hope to get back at some stage.
You were in government when the war in Ukraine, the full-scale invasion, happened. I don't want to ask you what happened around the cabinet table because obviously you can't betray cabinet confidence. But what was the instinctive reaction of the government at the time? What was the feeling about how you as a government would represent Australia in reacting to that invasion?
There was never a second of doubt that we would stand with democratic partners and allies in giving support. Now, Australia had built a relationship with Ukraine forged in tragedy, the tragedy of the MH17 air disaster. Before then, we had not had an embassy in Ukraine, which we can come back to. We had not had closeness of relations there, but that had built and established relations with Ukraine that people remembered. But of course then the response of the NATO countries, of the US and European partners and the UK all signalled that there was going to be strong support for Ukraine, a call for help from other partners, and there was not a second of doubt in the mind of Morrison government ministers that we should be there, should be supporting and should do so with whatever practical things Australia could lend a hand with.
So you spoke earlier about experiencing firsthand what Ukraine wants from Australia in terms of support. What do you feel that they need, and is there more that we should be doing?
There's certainly more that Australia can and should be doing. I want to be clear, we give 100% bipartisan support for everything that the Albanese government has done, but we think there's more that could and should be done. We should have looked at the Taipan helicopters situation differently and seen if there were ways to gift those helicopters or parts. And looking forward, the Abrams tanks that are due to be retired present a similar opportunity for us to get on the front foot of talking to Ukraine about whether these assets can help them and give that support. Ukraine's also built a model in terms of partnerships and alliance structures focused on different things. Now, Australia has joined that in relation to drones, and that's really welcome, and indeed, credit where it's due, the last package of support from the Albanese government was far stronger than some of the previous ones. But we need to look forward, not just be doing announcements aligned with anniversaries or events, but actually following the lead of the US, European, Japanese partners of what does a multi-year strategy and commitment look like? How do we then build that out and respond in other ways? And Ukrainian officials spoke to us about the potential to also join the demining partnership. Now, as Australians, we have both history and capability in that space. We played a huge role in the demining operations and activities for Cambodia's future in our region, and Australian companies have actually got real expertise that they are exporting to the world in that space that we could look to contribute and help.
Do you sense that the Australian public is behind you on that?
I think there is strong support still in Australia, and perhaps without some of the debates that even exist in other countries. Now, part of that, I'd like to think, is the bipartisanship. The political debate in Australia isn't one about whether or not we support Ukraine, but about how much we support Ukraine. And so that, I think, helps. I also think Australians do at least instinctively understand that Russia is not just acting in terms of its position against Ukraine, but is part of a global movement of disruption at present, and that disruption poses broader threats that we need to be part of pushing back against, and that ultimately, if Ukraine is successful and the partners like Australia and NATO standing with Ukraine have shown that we have the resolve and the fortitude to help Ukraine to a clear victory, well, then we will all be a little bit safer. But if Ukraine is not successful and Russia ultimately claims more Ukrainian territory under any peace settlement or approach, well, then the world is a little bit weaker and less safe because not only Russia but other global disruptors will see that as a sign of weakness from democratic nations willing to defend their interests and their own parties.
It's in our hands, and here I say our, not talking about Australia, but the Allies' hands, to actually give Ukraine the capability to defeat Russia, but we don't. We don't choose to. Is there a frustration from where you sit in Australia watching the limitations that allies have imposed upon themselves? At the same time, you say Ukraine needs to win to send this wider signal.
I think there have been some sliding doors moments in this conflict where Ukraine, who have done an amazing job, outliving all expectations at the start of the conflict, could have been in an even stronger position. Early debates about potential no-fly zones, then of course discussions about providing longer-range missiles or air capabilities. If these things had been decided upon in Ukraine's favour at an earlier juncture, then Ukraine may well be in a much stronger position, or the conflict potentially even over by today. And now we have the debates about whether and how Ukraine can use the weapons that it's got, as well as debates about whether Ukraine's neighbours could play a greater role in helping to shoot down drones and missiles that are close to their territory. And these things should be resolved in Ukraine's favour as well, because anything that can enhance Ukraine's ability to stop Russian attacks on Ukraine and to enable Ukraine to focus its efforts on regaining its territory and being in the strongest position for peace negotiations can yield the strongest possible outcome. I've been heartened to see and hear, including here at the GLOBSEC conference, European leaders starting to speak with a stronger voice, calling for a change in those rules and calling for Ukraine to be given the authority to use weapons as effectively as they possibly can. And I hope that the global partners, particularly other European leaders and the US, hear those messages and act on those messages to give Ukraine that capability to get the upper hand.
So you want Ukraine to be allowed to use these Western missiles to strike into Russian territory?
Ukraine should be able to take out the sites from which missiles are launched against Ukraine.
Whether they're in Russia?
Whether they're in Russia or not. That is indeed how many other partners respond. If you look at, for example, points in history when US assets in different countries have been attacked, the US targeted tactical response is usually to strike at the point that those missiles or attacks were launched from. It's a consistent part of trying to disable the attack against you, as well as sending a strong message. In Ukraine's case, they are at war, and they should be able to disable the sources of the attacks against them, to give them a stronger hand, and to make Russia think harder about whether this war is worth continuing in the way that they pursue it.
How do you explain the decision then to tie Ukraine's hands behind its back on this?
I can understand the strategic debates that NATO countries have had about their concerns of being drawn further into a war or a conflict, and that perhaps understandably explains some of the choices made in those sliding doors moments I referenced before. But I think at this point, Russia has shown time and again that many of their threats have been hollow, and that their approaches are ones that, with the right resolve and resources to Ukraine, can be defeated. And if they can be defeated, then it should be defeated. And Ukraine has also shown time and again that its resolve is amazingly impressive, and their focus and tactics have, even when they've hit low points, bounced back to show the world that in fact there are surprises up their sleeves, and that they should be trusted to mount the type of strategies that can give them the upper hand in ultimately what we hope are peace negotiations that can secure, as Ukraine calls for, a just, lasting and comprehensive peace.
One thing we hear quite often in Australia, and it's actually come out of the mouth of the Prime Minister at the moment, Anthony Albanese, is these conflicts are far away from Australia. What has visiting Ukraine taught you about whether or not you believe these conflicts are closer to home than we might like to think?
The physical conflict is far away, but the increasing linkages and connections of what is enabling Russia to maintain this war and fight this war come closer to home and point to the broader strategic challenges that we face to preserve peace and security in our own region and around the world. And what I mean by that is clearly the role in which Iran and North Korea are supplying as weapons providers, but with parts that appear to come out of Chinese supply chains, and of course with financing and resourcing that clearly comes from China. Now, China's place in the world is one that I welcome a growing role from economically, and that should include diplomatically. But how China exercises that diplomatic power and economic power matters. And in this case, they have failed to provide and to exercise the power that could have changed the course of this war, that could have prevented Russia from continuing it for so long. Their enabling sends all of the wrong signals in terms of peace and security around the world and in our region.
I mean, I'm interested to hear you talk about that, because what we are seeing from your side of politics since you lost government is an overall softening in your tone about how you want to deal with China next time you're in power. So, do you feel that under your government, when our relations really did reach a nadir, you made a mistake?
I don't think any of the actions we undertook were mistaken, and the fact that the Albanese government hasn't changed any of those policy settings is, I think, a demonstration that whether it was our foreign interference laws, our security of critical infrastructure laws, our decision to ban Huawei, these were all valid and necessary policy steps to safeguard and protect Australia's national interests.
Sure, but they're also not seeking an inquiry into the origins of COVID and proposing weapons inspector-like powers for the interrogators of that review, are they?
Well, times have moved on, and most people don't want to talk about COVID nowadays, I've noticed. They're happy to put that in the past.
Including yourself?
I'm happy to put that in the past too, in terms of COVID. I think, our approach, as I look as the Shadow Foreign Minister, the approach that I would seek to bring in a Peter Dutton-led coalition government, would be one that is both principled and predictable. And what I mean by that is we should absolutely stand firm in relation to Australia's principles about respect for international rules and laws and norms, and that includes how you conduct your military operations in our region, and the concerns that we clearly have about China's use of aggressive tactics against the Philippines and others. We should be very principled in standing firm on those grounds. But we should also be entirely predictable that we would be standing firm in those grounds, and that Chinese officials should understand clearly that is the Australian position. They should expect to hear it, put politely, but clearly and forcefully. And in that sense, we should be making sure there are no surprises to the relationship and the way in which we manage the relationship, and that we are also clear about, as Peter Dutton has said, that we welcome China's growth. It is not a containment strategy. As Peter said, we'd love to see our trade with China double. We'd love to see China continue to grow, because the economic miracle of China's growth has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But we do seek, as China now is a world power, to ensure that how they exercise that power is done in a manner that protects the peace and stability of our region. We seek no more than that in terms of what we aspire for in the region, of peace and stability that enables that prosperity of all to continue to grow.
You say it's not a containment strategy, but our ally America is absolutely invested in containing China.
Well, they have their economic policies and approaches. Our approach is one where Australia still is an open, outward trading economy, where, of course, we have strategies to seek to diversify our trade, to seek to ensure better securitisation of key supply chains. And these are important considerations for us, but we are also still an open trading economy looking to trade vigorously with and in our region and welcoming the continued economic growth of our region. And the Asia-Pacific region, the Indo-Pacific region have been and are the global economic powerhouses for growth across the world. And that's what we should seek to protect, because that's what underpins the prosperity of Australians and all across the region. And our creation of a deterrence framework for aggressive military actions in the region, our increased defence spending, is all about deterring the type of conflict that would undermine that prosperity and undermine those economic fundamentals.
Are you saying it's desirable for us to have China as our trade dependency? That's not something you would ever want to see or you could envision seeing changing in the future?
I think there's some realities that we need to deal with here. China is by far and away the biggest economy in our region. And when you look around the world, for most countries, their biggest trading partner will be the biggest economy in their region. For much of Europe, that's Germany. For the Americas, that's the United States. Across our region, that's predominantly China, or for some, India. So logically, there is a factual, geographic-based relationship that exists there. But should we seek to continue to diversify our trade? Absolutely. We have huge opportunities still with India. We should be committed to further pursuit of strategies in Southeast Asia, and I, for one, would love to see further focus on Indonesia as the trade minister that finally saw the Indonesia-Australia agreement finalised, signed and entered into force. It breaks my heart a little at the fact that it entered into force in the middle of COVID, when we couldn't give the impetus behind it that we should have. And so I hope that we can revisit those opportunities for diversification and for broadening out our trade. And I think Australian businesses should understand, and I think many do understand, that the risk profile of China has changed. Their actions of the trade coercion attempted against Australia were ones that brought upon themselves a change in that risk profile and meant that for many Australian businesses the incentive to diversify is greater, because the risk of having too many eggs in one basket is now evident, given the way in which China was happy to directly breach the undertakings that it gave to us under the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement.
And I'm glad you raised that economic coercion, because I think that's the difference in what you pointed out about everyone depending on the biggest economy in their region. Yes, okay, the Europeans depend on Germany, the Americas on America, but those economies don't coerce their trade partners when they have a disagreement over politics. Ours does. And so we are dependent on somebody that is willing to use our weakness against us.
And it's why that risk profile has changed. It's why Australian businesses should diversify. It's also why we should be proud as a nation for the way in which we withstood that coercion too. There was very little reaction from Australian industry in terms of calls to change policies or I think we showed great strength as a country, great resolve, and our economy continued to push through those measures too. That's not to say that some businesses and some industries didn't feel pain. My pre-politics job was working in the wine industry, and I know how much pain some of those businesses have and continue to feel. But as a nation, I think there was enormous resolve, and even in an industry feeling that pain, they wanted the pain to go away. They wanted the sanctions to go away, but never did they come and say, you should ditch this policy or change this approach. They were actually quite understanding of the national interest that was underpinning the approach of the government of the day.
You're here in Europe for the best part of a week. What is your view about how well Australia is engaging with Europe at the moment?
I think there is always more that we can do, and I remain very disappointed that the Australia-EU Free Trade Agreement negotiations went off the rails. And I think Prime Minister Albanese was found missing in action on that. That whilst the going off the rails of those negotiations may not have been his fault or even Australia's fault, The fact that there was no effort at the leaders' level to pick the phone up, to speak to Ursula von der Leyen, to say, how could we possibly get this back on track, was a missed opportunity and a lack of leadership from the Prime Minister. I know in previous negotiations how it takes that leader-level negotiation to just get the final things done or to unlock the really hard parts of it. And the FTA matters because it's about the type of diversification we were talking of before and how now in this contested world liberal market economies come together to make each other as strong as possible. And the idea that Australia and the European Union still have antiquated trade barriers and restrictions on investment flows is completely counter to the type of shared economic strength that we should both be seeking to build that can then better support us to be resilient in other ways, including in the investment of defence deterrence.
Do you think that this is really an achievable goal though, anymore?
I think the longer it's now gone on, the harder parts of it become. And different parts of domestic politics in Europe are clearly making that trickier. But I think that's why also we need to make sure the arguments we make are about the big picture strategic piece of this as well. That it's not just bogged in the weeds of arguments about agricultural support or subsidies, and it's not just seen purely through the lens of a free trade agenda, but actually this is about ensuring that democratic market economies are backing each other in, that there are debates that others may wish to have about how they engage with the rest of the world and with non-market economies and with non-democracies, but surely those of us who share the values of being market economies and liberal democracies should be able to prove that we can get these sorts of deals done.
If you're Foreign Minister again, I mean, you had a lot of experience of this in government. It's an exhausting travel schedule for an Australian trade or foreign minister because of our distance. Do you think there's any space to perhaps broaden the amount of representatives we send overseas? So the British, for example, and the United States, they have an Asia-Pacific minister under the Secretary of State. They'll have a Europe minister under the Secretary of State. Is there ever a world where you could see a bit of a restructure in the way we represent ourselves abroad?
Well, we historically and currently, in fact, have 3 ministers in the foreign affairs space and at least 2 in the trade space. And our shadow structures are similarly deployed. I think it's important that we, perhaps in Australia, give greater standing and understanding to the role of the Pacific Minister and also their international development responsibilities, to the assistant ministers and the way in which they can help to represent the country, but also actually the broader cabinet architecture too. I'm a believer that we should have a more coordinated approach to the way in which cabinet ministers engage across the world. And particularly, we're here in Prague having this conversation. It's not easy for a busy foreign minister to get to every European capital. But often we'll find during the course of the year that lots of Australian ministers will come to Europe for different roles related to their portfolios. How we more strategically think about ensuring that added on to that work that might take them to Berlin or Paris or Amsterdam or London, but that they are also encouraged to look at building those connections with the countries that a foreign minister or other foreign ministers can't get to, but perhaps an industry minister or a resources minister or an assistant treasurer can look at adding an extra leg on that gives us the ability to strengthen those ties with nations who are important as fellow partners around the world. And it's not just here in Europe, it's also critically the battle for the hearts and minds of many other nations across the so-called global south, where we see a real effort by China to try to define itself as a leader of those countries, when in fact we want those countries to understand that their sovereignty, their ability to stand as independent nations articulating their own policy is something that is backed strongly and firmly by partners right around the world, including Australia.
Let's finish where we began, which is with your trip to Ukraine. This has obviously been a focus of this conference in Prague. What has the experience of encountering war firsthand taught you about what Australia needs to also absorb and learn, perhaps?
There's the need for preparedness, and then there's, I think, the values proposition that underpins understanding what it is that we must always seek to protect and defend. And so preparedness goes to how we create that deterrence, and deterrence lies across three pillars really in my mind. Deterrence by example, which is why helping Ukraine win matters right now. Deterrence through defence investment and capability, which is where increasing that and effectively making decisions that quickly deliver on that capability is so critical. And deterrence through diplomacy and building the strongest possible networks of nations wanting to see rules respected and upheld is critical. But then there is also the psychological and values-based approach, where as Australians we must never lose sight of the need to defend our democratic values, our way of life, and our interests, which are not just defined by the continental shelf of Australia, but are also about protecting our region as an open trading region with sea lanes and routes and opportunities for engagement across that region that are respected and maintained by all within our region.
Okay, well, we've come to a part on the podcast where you get to ask me anything. If Mick was here, you would get to ask him anything too. I don't know if you want to take it up, but you're welcome. It's a section where you get to ask a question. It can be anything you want.
Well, Latika, like me, you've been here at GLOBSEC for a few days. What do you think we must do or should be doing as Australians to ensure that European leaders, particularly Central European leaders, are thinking about and engaging with the Indo-Pacific?
I think presence definitely matters, so it's great to see you here. I was talking to the organisers yesterday and they said, we have so much trouble getting Australians to these conferences. We always invite the government and we don't get responses because, it's so far away. I think sometimes Australians want to deal themselves out of the equation by using this faraway excuse, and I think that's something we really have to rectify, because the last thing we need is people thinking we're not present or close. And I think also we are in a good place to demonstrate or talk about how to make that linkage between the two theatres that we're seeing in terms of conflict, and obviously in our region it's not kinetic, but it is strategic competition underway and everyone's caught up in the flurry of what the US and China are doing. So I think Australia has a unique ability to be able to say, well, here's a middle power caught in the middle of that and here's how we've dealt with it. So I think presence is really, really important. And I also think coming to the table with some ambitious foreign policy roles for Australia should not be outside of our remit. I don't buy this argument that because we're far away, we're not involved or have a stake in some of these conflicts in the region. The Middle East is a good example. We should absolutely be. There is no reason in my mind why Norway can see itself as a broker of an Oslo Accord and Australia couldn't. We can afford to be ambitious because of our distance, because of our apartness from the rest of the world. And I think sometimes we confuse the distance and use it against ourselves when we can actually turn it into a strategic benefit.
And if I can throw one other one, which I think has me thinking out of discussions I had with some of the other people from our region who've been here. We see in Europe very different histories and backgrounds in terms of how Western Europe versus Central Europe think, but and still bring different perspectives and don't always agree, but how they are seeking to forge the coming together. In our own region, the challenge is even greater in terms of the diversity of nations across Southeast Asia, different structures of government, different demographics and religion, different levels of development status. But are there any lessons you observe in the European approach that maybe we should try to bring to how we better align the cooperation and interests of our own diverse region?
Hang on, that's two questions.
I must have been watching you at press conferences.
I'm the interviewer here, Simon.
No, I mean, I think certainly from my discussions with the Europeans, they're always constantly reinforcing to me how different Europe is, and this was something that was demonstrated to me during the recent European elections. You go to these countries and they are completely different. There is no homogenous Europe that we talk about. And I think, as you rightly say, in our region, it's much harder because we have different shaped democracies, and Singapore's a good example, That's a very strategic ally that we have no problem with. But would you strictly call it democracy? Do we want to get bogged down in these arguments? Probably not. And I think that's probably a mistake maybe that we've made in this democracy-authoritarian binary that perhaps we need to let go of and start dealing with a more practical reality. I don't think that comes to any sort of consensus architecture, though, and I think that's probably for the better. Sometimes I'm not entirely sure that the European free trade deal is a good example. So many countries got stymied on the benefits of that because of one lobby group, French farmers, and I don't think that's entirely fair. So I do favour the kind of mini-lateral architectures that we're going for, actually.
I think we could, I'm sure I could come up with lots more questions, but there's no bottle of wine in sight, so we should wrap up.
You need to start your own podcast. Simon Birmingham, thank you for joining.
Thanks, Latika, my pleasure.